the physical one that will soon be adorned in our lobby. Because today we're honoring openness, compassion, tolerance, freedom of conscience, the quest for knowledge, and the love of reading. All good things. I want to thank Margaret for being the juggernaut that since 2007 has been trying to make sure that the Chester County Courthouse holiday display is as inclusive as possible. For those of you who don't know the story, she can tell you more, but very briefly, a couple of years ago, they sponsored a tree of knowledge at the courthouse, decorated with freethought, humanist, and skeptic books, and that was meant to complement the Jewish, the Christian, and the Santa displays that were there, and it represents the right of people of all faiths and worldviews, religious and secular, to feel included and welcome during the holidays. To some others, however, it meant something different. To some people of some traditional faiths, they found it insulting and arrogant and even heretical, and it scared them so much that they took things into their own hands and began to vandalize the Tree of Knowledge out in Westchester on numerous occasions, and instead of standing up to such intolerance, the commissioners simply decided to get rid of the Tree of Knowledge. So, in the Freethought Society room at the inn. But today, during this talk, I want to focus on the organic, growing, but metaphorical tree of knowledge that this physical tree is really a reflection of. For centuries, it stayed alive only because of the hard work of many to nourish it with the written word. Really, it was planted by writers, nurtured by bookmakers, and harvested by readers, and it blossomed during the Renaissance and during the Enlightenment, and it's fundamental to humanism and to ethical culture, and we have to keep it growing. Now, ethical humanism certainly was built on books provided by the Tree of Knowledge. Volumes and volumes of books lined the bookshelves of the home of the founder of ethical humanism, Felix Adler. His father, Samuel, a rabbi and scholar, found that his happiest hours were those spent in his library, well stocked with books from a wide variety of disciplines. And books and readings have always been a huge part of Jewish tradition. 12th century scholar Tibbon saw his personal library as his most precious gift to his son. In his personal will, he called it, quote, "my best companion and my best treasure." His advice to all of us is to nurture our libraries like a living garden, protecting it, helping it grow. He wrote, quote, "Let your bookcases and your shelves be your gardens and your pleasure grounds. Pluck the fruit that grows therein, gather the roses, the spices, and the myrrh." Now, Samuel Adler continued to encourage his son Felix to read and spend time in this garden. And Felix did read voraciously, and he cultivated an encyclopedic mind and a new rational alternative to traditional religions. Technology. That's why I don't have a Kindle. I still don't trust it. Felix Adler was an individual who read an immense amount, and that tradition is really a big part of ethical culture. When I was training to be a leader in ethical humanism, books were the core. I was with mentors from the American Ethical Union and the Humanist Institute. Humanism was really revealed to me page after page after page. I didn't know a lot about it before I got into this training. Our life here, the Ethical Humanists of Philadelphia, is greatly warmed by many, many book discussions. And I love the fact that my office wall is adorned with books. Way too many for me to read, but it's very inspirational just to be around such a collection. As an aside, actually, somebody very close to our society administrator, Dottie McBride, recently contributed greatly to our national book culture. Dottie's brother, James McBride, just won the National Book Award for Fiction for his book, The Good Lord Bird. Many of us here have already read his book, The Color of Water, which is a wonderfully written book, a memoir of he and Dottie's mother. And hopefully after the rush of publicity that he's getting, maybe we can lure him back here to give a talk and to share his love of the written word. Because for humanists who don't rely on supernaturalism, the written word is really one of the most reliable sources for liberation and growth. It frees us from narrow experience, it encourages a free thought, and it engenders wisdom. And one way to spread humanism in this city, I think we may be low on a battery, is to have a contribution to the Philadelphia school systems, for example, to make sure their libraries are stocked, let alone having nurses and teachers and enough counselors for everybody. Just having books in the library is important. At the Ethical Society, we have our own little tradition every year where we contribute dictionaries to a local school. Tema and others bring dictionaries and offer enthusiastic third graders a mini workshop on how to use the books, especially the appendix of dictionaries. There, Tema says a lot of the kids really like the pages that talk about planets and presidents and states and continents and countries. I think I'll just do that. And they really have a lot of fun looking at the sign language page in the dictionary. And they also have a page with the words, the English language's longest word, which I think has 1,000 letters in it, right? And they're amazed at that, right? It's a chemical compound, so I don't think it counts, really. So. Philadelphia certainly was built on books. James Logan, the mayor in the early 1720s, established one of the largest libraries in the colonies. It fed the hungry minds of scientists and academics who converged on Philadelphia as a center of academic life. I think it's very appropriate that the main branch of the library today is on Logan Circle. It's the center of a network of 54 libraries around the city. Logan actually supported intellectual life greatly. He was a tutor of a future world-famous botanist, John Bartram, and he was also a mentor of none other than Benjamin Franklin. And certainly Benjamin Franklin built his life around books. He was first and foremost, in his own mind, a printer. That's how he described himself in his will. He also was a librarian. In 1731, he and members of his group, called the Junto, began the Library Company of Philadelphia. It was the first lending library on the continent. Franklin called the library company, these are his words, the mother of all North American subscription libraries. It's got a colloquial ring to it. The founding group had a motto that actually reflects a nearly religious dedication to literacy and wisdom. It's a Latin phrase that loosely translates into the words, "To support the common good is divine." Indeed, I think libraries come as close to being sacred places for freethinkers as any place can be. So, I would say that their mecca for freethinkers is the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. It's the closest I think we can get to a holy site for humanism. Last week I visited there just as buses were unloading and people were coming off in droves. And I had the sense that these were like pilgrims coming to Chartres and Notre Dame. This building is an incredible piece of architecture. It's the first to be installed with electricity. And it was finished in 1897. If there are any miracles in humanism, this is one of them. It was finished on time and under budget. Maybe the last big building in Washington so done. It's filled with incredible inspirational paintings and vaulted arches and mosaics and stained glass windows. On the first floor of the Great Hall, it's like a nave to this Italian Renaissance building with 75-foot ceilings, topped with stained glass skylights and triangular ceiling vaults inscribed with the names of writers and book publishers. That's where my tour started. My guide was John, and he took me first with our group, to a series of murals that depicted the evolution of information transfer. It was very interesting. The first one was oral storytelling of somebody talking to a group of nomads. And the next was hieroglyphics being written. And then scribes etching words into stone. And then a painting of symbols being painted onto animal hides. And then monistic calligraphers with their quill and pen. And the last one was the Gutenberg press, perhaps the greatest technological contribution to humanism of all. Then John took us up towards the reading room overlook. And there at the top of the stairs was a lovely mosaic of Minerva, the goddess of universal wisdom. And this scarf is a picture of her. And she's holding a scroll. Don't tell my wife this is a Christmas present. On the scroll are all the various major areas of classical study like astronomy, history, mechanics, education, agriculture, government, geography, statistics, economics, poetry, sculpture, and many, many more. And behind this mural is the reading room that looks out onto the Library of Congress. how many have been up to that overlook in the Library of Congress? Oh, it's absolutely gorgeous. Around the rotunda are 12 statues, unfortunately all men, but 12 statues that were, thank you. Yeah, sorry, I'll go with that for now. 12 statues of men that represented the areas of knowledge. Let's see whether that works. They include Moses and St. Paul representing the religious literature, Robert Fulton and Columbus for commerce, Edward Gibbon and Herodotus for history, Beethoven and Michelangelo for art, Francis Bacon and Plato for philosophy, Homer and Shakespeare for poetry, James Kent and Solon for law, and Joseph Henry and Isaac Newton for science. And right above them are figures of women. Unfortunately, they're not individual women, they are representative women. They represent the virtues. I like particularly the one representing history was a woman holding a mirror looking backwards over her shoulder, representing looking at the past. And the woman representing science held it facing forward, reflecting the future. So there are all these various lessons in the artwork of the Library of Congress. Far below them, under the dome, are 236 desks that ring around a circulation center where the librarians and the curators are scurrying around at their tasks. A lot of these pictures are captured in this incredible book that I picked up when I visited. You're welcome to take a look at it. It's got all the artwork of the Library of Congress in it. It was a far cry from what the Library of Congress was in 1800 when it was located in the Capitol. It was burned by the British in 1814, and it was resurrected greatly thanks to an individual who said, "I cannot live without books." Who knows that quote? Jefferson, he did. When he was really one of America's first great Enlightenment thinkers who said that he was trying to model his life after the Roman philosopher Cicero. And Cicero said, to add a library to a house is to give that house a soul. That deep, deep commitment to books. Jefferson spent most of his life collecting books. When he was minister to France, he sent thousands of books back to Monticello. And in 1814, when the British burnt the Capitol and 3,000 books were destroyed, he offered to sell his collection to the Congress. And a year and $23,000 later, we had the Library of Congress with the largest collections of books in the United States, 6,000 works. It represented Jefferson's encyclopedic interest. It had works on art and architecture and fiction and science and geography and languages, all areas of knowledge he thought were absolutely necessary for a democracy to flourish. Citizens he thought had to know everything, which is maybe one reason why he included books on beekeeping and beer making. So, truly what a democracy needs. Today, the Library of Congress has 150 million items. It's the second largest in the world. Second to, anybody know? The British Library beats us by 170 items. Third place is the New York Public Library with 53 million items. Then the Russian State Library, the National Diet Library in Tokyo. Sixth is the National Library of China in Beijing. But the next 13 libraries on that list in size are all in North America and Europe, which I think really emphasizes how important books and the written word are to Western history and culture. Over the course of history, obviously, there have been collections all over the world. There's, for example, 14,000 stone tablets full of Buddhist scriptures that exist, that go back all the way to the 7th century CE, that are safe and secure in the temples of the Yunjin caves in China. But a lot of the ancient collections were not so lucky. For example, the Library of Alexandria in Egypt, which was founded in 228 BCE, had 700,000 scrolls and attracted scholars from all over the Mediterranean, including the mathematician Euclid. But fires and invasions eventually withered down that library until it was gone at about 400 CE. Now, some of the fires at Alexandria were accidental, but many were set on purpose. They were set on purpose by Romans, by Coptics, by Muslims. And the destructions of books, which I read are called by some biblioclasm or libricide, is quite common. I'm just going to give you a few examples, starting with 1193 AD. The Muslims sacked India's Naldala University, destroying Buddhist texts. In Constantinople, just a few years after that, Knights of the Fourth Crusades destroyed the Imperial Library. In 1258 AD, Mongol invaders sacked Baghdad's House of Wisdom, and they threw all the books into the Tigris River, which, according to witnesses, turned black with the ink from the books. That's how many there were. Such attacks continued into modernity. Today, in 1992, the century-old National Library of Bosnia-Herzegovina was shelled by Serbian troops attacking Sarajevo, and that actually led to the largest book burning in the history of humankind. In 1998, the Taliban destroyed 55,000 books and manuscripts in the Paul Khomeini Library in Afghanistan. Baghdad is again the victim in 2003 during the war when the Iraq National Library was attacked and looted. And just this year, Islamic extremists in Timbuktu, Mali, destroyed thousands of manuscripts over 800 years old. The mayor knew that there were no replacements for these works. And he said, quote, "This is terrible news. By destroying them, they threaten the world." Now, it is, of course, heaven and not the world that motivated many book burners. So I want to turn to that focus. In 1499, for example, during the Spanish Inquisition, Cardinal Cisneros burned books that focused on human beings rather than God. In 1562, the Spanish friars, who were so frustrated at not getting the indigenous all to convert, burned all samples of Mayan writings that they could find. Civilization lost access to priceless Mayan history, calculations, astronomical observations, calendars. The self-satisfied Bishop Delandia gleefully reported that what was destroyed was, quote, "contained nothing in which were not to be seen as superstition and lies of the devil." So religious intolerance is probably the most common cause of book burning, and the bonfires were harbingers for even greater evil, because in the writing of books that were ended up being burned, quite often human beings followed. Talking about the burning of the Quran in 1821, Heinrich Heine noted that ink and blood often run together. He said, quote, "Where they burn books, so too they will end burning human beings." Obviously, this was the case in the Holocaust. Focus of the film that's just out, The Book Thief, where fascists saw very little difference between burning books and bodies. The Germans destroyed words and human beings in bonfires, bombings, death camp furnaces, and even the Allied bombings distinguished little between human beings and writings. Franklin Delano Roosevelt noted, ironically, how often that books fared better than people. He said, "Books cannot be killed by fire. People die, but books never die. No man, no force can abolish memory." And I think that's interesting, that the written word is so resilient. Despite no matter how hard the forces of oppression try, they keep coming back. Often, actually, repression backfires. Take, for example, the Vatican, which for years published an index of banned books. You know this? It was a list of all the books that they banned, and they discontinued doing that when they found out that people were using it to find the books. It was like a great guide to finding the banned books. Even today, similar things occur. For example, Salman Rushdie was mentioned. Satanic Verses was selling about 100 copies a week until the fatwa, after which 750,000 books were sold. And the greatest book burning regime in history, the Nazis, found that French anti-fascists began a, quote, library of burned books, which collected all the books that the Nazis condemned. Well, it was the flames of World War II that actually inspired a writer, Ray Bradbury, to write his book Fahrenheit 451, which is the approximate temperature that books burn at. Bradbury said that quote, "It follows that when Hitler burned a book, I felt it as keenly, please forgive me, as his killing a human. For in the long sum of history, they are one and the same flesh." Interesting. Books were so important to how Bradbury engaged with the world. According to his biographer, the very last essay Bradbury wrote was a childhood memory of being in a library. It went like this. When I was 7 years old, I started going to the library and I took about 10 books out a week. The librarian looked at me and said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "You can't possibly read all those books before they're due back." I said, "Yes, I can." And I came back the next week for 10 more books. And in doing so, I told the librarian politely to get out of my way and let me happen. That's what books do. They are the building blocks, the DNA, if you will, of you. Think of everything you've ever read, everything you've ever learned, holding a book in your hands, and how the knowledge shaped you and made you who you are today. Looking back now on all those years to when I first discovered books at the library, I see that I was simply falling in love. Day after glorious day, I was falling in love with books. That's neat. Another veteran of World War II who was eagerly defending libraries during the McCarthy era when books were being burnt, praised libraries. General Eisenhower said, "Don't join the book burners. Don't think you're going to conceal faults by concealing evidence that they ever existed. Don't be afraid to go to your library and read every book." Now, Americans had plenty of intolerance towards books. I'm going to turn to Anthony Comstock, who in 1873 founded the Society for the Suppression of Vice, whose seal actually depicted book burning. I taped some back there. This side is book burning, this is leading a terrible person into jail. Comstock is said to have destroyed 15 tons of lewd books. Books lewd in Anthony Comstock's eyes, of course. Susan Jacoby wrote that one reason why his movement was supported was that there was an increase in books in the United States that talked about the human body and nature, for example, and that somehow these were sinful things. Robert Ingersoll, who was one of Comstock's greatest critics, warned that censorship both threatened democracy and free thought, and he saw an unholy alliance between intolerance and fundamentalism. And he attacked them both. He proclaimed, "Give me the storm and the tempest of thought and action rather than the dead calm of ignorance and faith. Banish me from Eden, if you will, but let me first eat the fruit of the tree of knowledge." For Ingersoll, this biblical depiction of knowledge as the source of hubris and sin and corruption, for me, is at root an attempt to control with fear and intolerance and ignorance. And it goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden. The faithful tell us that there the tree of knowledge grew and offered delicious forbidden fruit. And when the devil incarnated as a snake convinced Adam and Eve to take a bite, it marked the fall of man and woman. Unable to resist, human beings chose knowledge over submission to God. And there arises this cultural bias against human wisdom. So it's no wonder that religious intolerance and piety are so often wrapped up in attacks on books, libraries, and wisdoms. These were the things, the religious tell us, that drove us from the Garden of Eden. But for humanists, our garden are books. It's precisely the garden of wisdom that calls us to bring out our best. Argentinian writer Jorge Luis Borges said, "I have always imagined paradise as a kind of library." The Renaissance brought forth these libraries. Universities were grown. They created engaged citizenship. Scholars embraced new works and discoveries. Erasmus, one of the most important humanists of his times, tried to use books to advance society. Rhetoric and moral philosophy were taught in schools so people would be better citizens. The arts portrayed human beings more realistically and as a central concern, endowed with both the responsibility and the hope to create a better world. Man did become the measure of all things, and discoveries in science and optics and mapping during the Renaissance and the Enlightenment turned human beings from the vertical into the horizontal. Rather than being concerned with God above, we began to be concerned with each other here and now. Books and maps and ledgers began to fill the libraries of scholars and government officials and tradesmen. And Gutenberg's press really accelerated the embrace of the written word by making books less expensive and more available, and no longer were we dependent on monastic scribes. As the Enlightenment accelerated, the public became more literate, more public libraries were formed, books were published in their local dialects, not just in Latin. King Louis XVI proudly created the Lyon Public Library, which had over 55,000 volumes. Denis Diderot began his, quote, systemic dictionary of sciences, arts, and crafts, known as the Encyclopedia. This was published between 1751 and 1772. It took up 28 volumes, 71,000 plus articles, and was intended, according to Diderot, to, quote, change the way people thought. So this was a grand project, and the encyclopedia contained a lot of radical and subversive elements, but it posed a problem for Louis XVI because it was the crowning jewel in France's intellectual crown. So as a result, he allowed it to continue to be published. It was also something that questioned, however, the sovereignty of the church. The church no longer had a monopoly. The encyclopedia and the Enlightenment proclaimed religious sovereignty to every individual. So when the Age of Revolution came about and the American colonies became a country, Enlightenment and humanist values were everywhere. Thomas Paine's The Age of Reason advocated free thought as a sounder guide to a fledgling democracy. For this, he was slandered, he was arrested, he was nearly executed, he died a pauper and marginalized, and he had an obituary that had one line that pleased many of his enemies. In it, it said, "He lived long, did some good, and much harm." He was really the first martyr to American humanism. Now, the widespread use of the term humanism wasn't really heard until about 1808, and it was noted to designate a bundle of academic subjects, including grammar, rhetoric, poetry, history, moral philosophy, which praised human beings as both important and responsible for, quote, this worldly goals, the here and now. It emphasized that it was necessary for democracy, and there's a neat mural in the Library of Congress that gives a little moral lesson on what happens if a civilization forgets books. It's a picture entitled Anarchy, and in it, rubble has fallen all over, and it's crushing books everywhere. And the lead character is stepping on a manuscript and holding up a burning document, representing the chaos that would ensue if we let our books get destroyed. Now, prior to the Civil War, you have Horace Mann, who was the leader of the Common School movement, and he planted the seeds for reading in the United States through a public education system. As technology grew and farming became more sophisticated, you had the growth of land-grant colleges across the United States in the late 1800s, which led to a lot more books being available, and advocates of science and reason and tolerance began publishing journals and articles that questioned the status quo. Probably the most profoundly important free thought journal was one called The Truth Seeker by D.M. Bennett. The Truth Seeker journal had on its masthead the following mission in 1873. It was devoted to, quote, science, morals, free thought, free discussions, liberalism, sexual equality, labor reform, progression, free education, and whatever tends to elevate and emancipate the human race. I think it's a pretty good mission. I could sign up for that. This was shocking, though, to conservative critics. The Truth Seeker was very fond of the words of Felix Adler, the founder of ethical culture, and actually devoted a lot of space to his speeches. You also had contributions from Clarence Darrow, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Mark Twain, Margaret Sanger, and they echoed the voices of Voltaire and Thomas Paine and Jefferson, and it wasn't long before Comstock was calling for Bennett's head. Nicknamed by conservative forces the devil's own advocate, Bennett had to spend time and money defending himself in courts, ended up serving 13 months of hard labor in a federal penitentiary for obscenity, and was another martyr for American free thought. But nevertheless, the Truth Seeker journal continued to be published and more journals flourished. In 1895, when Elizabeth Cady Stanton published one of the most important books, The Woman's Bible, she experienced similar intolerance. She had hoped that this Bible would simply be a way to liberate women from the subservient role that was given to them by many interpreters of the Bible. The Woman's Bible was an instant bestseller, but garnered for the 80-year-old hero of the suffrage movement a lot of condemnation. Not only by conservatives, but even by the Suffrage Association, because it was too radical for them. And that was despite Susan B. Anthony asking the Suffrage Association to please, quote, vote for religious liberty without censorship or inquisition. It was about this time that a leading robber baron probably did more for books than any other person in history. Anybody know who I'm talking about?
Carnegie.
Andrew Carnegie, gave $350 million for the construction of libraries. In today's terms, that's more than $4.3 billion. He said, "There's not such a cradle of democracy upon the earth as the free public library. This republic of letters where neither rank, office, nor wealth receives the slightest consideration." Susan Jacoby actually said that freethought probably was getting a lot more popular due to the fact that public libraries were available to the average reader. Now, there's always going to be burk burners, there's always going to be censors. They're going to meddle with our libraries, they're going to read our email, they're going to spy into our cyber lives. And we know that these things have to be resisted because they not only threaten our own liberty, but they threaten knowledge itself. We have to be vigilant, we have to protest it. But I want to finish today on a slightly different and a more modern challenge to the tree of knowledge. How difficult it is really to be open to a diversity of ideas, especially when we have to handle a flood of information at our fingertips. In order really to be open to diversity of thought, my personal biggest challenge, at least, is not that I can't get books of different views. I can. It's my tendency to only read what I already agree with. Or watch news programs that simply confirm our existing beliefs. Because after all, it takes a lot more work to read what you don't believe in. I know it is for me. I have to strive to be open, to try to learn about all perspectives, and to teach my children to do the same. And that's probably the hardest thing to do. Are we willing to encourage our young people to explore a broad array of perspectives from all across the spectrum, from socialist to libertarian, to conservative, from atheist to non-theist, to theist? Are we willing to trust in critical thinking and dialogue? This is what Dale McGowan advocates in his book, Parenting Beyond Belief. I fully recommend it to you. He wants children to think for himself. He's a free thinker, he's an atheist, but he doesn't want his children to be that because he is. He wants them to be that because they think carefully. And thinking carefully means being open. Daniel Dennett talked a lot about this in his book, Breaking the Spell. He argued that we should teach not less but more religion in school. I'm going to read a bunch of his to conclude. He says, let's get more education about religion into our schools, not less. We should teach our children creeds and customs, prohibitions and rituals, texts and music. And when we cover the history of religion, we should include both the positive, the role of the churches in the civil rights movements of the 1960s, the flourishing of science and arts in early Islam, the role of black Muslims in bringing hope, honor, and self-respect to the otherwise shattered lives of many inmates in our prison, and the negative, the Inquisition, anti-Semitism over the ages, the role of the Catholic Church in spreading AIDS in Africa by opposing condoms. No religion should be favored, none ignored. He continues, it's just an idea, and perhaps there are better ones to consider, but it should appeal to freedom lovers everywhere. The idea that insisting that the devout of all faiths should face the challenge of making sure their creed is worthy enough, attractive and plausible and meaningful enough to withstand the temptations of its competitors. If you have to hoodwink or blindfold your children to ensure that they'll confirm their faith when they're adults, your faith ought to go extinct. Dennett believes that by opening the minds of all young people and giving them shared store of mutual knowledge about all religions, you'll protect them, quote, from the toxic form of religion that spring up in every tradition. That's what the humanist tradition is about. Faith in human beings and individuals and collectives, to take in a wide array of evidence, read many words, hear many stories, and work through them so as to live the most ethical and rational life we can. If we're going to keep the tree of knowledge alive, we have to taste all of its fruits. I think perhaps a good variety of mental food is best for our intellectual health, even those we disagree with. John Kennedy said so when he praised libraries. He said, if this nation is to be wise as well as strong, if we're to achieve our destiny, then we need more ideas, more reading, more good books, and more public libraries. These libraries should be open to all except the censor. We know all the facts and hear all the alternatives and listen to all the criticisms. Let us welcome controversial books and controversial authors, for the Bill of Rights is the guardian of our security and freedom. So if we're going to be good citizens, if we're going to be good humanists, we have to be open to a wide variety of books. Andrew Carnegie put his money where his mouth is. He offered that, quote, a library outranks any other one thing a community can do to benefit its people. It's a never-failing spring in the desert. And we have to make sure that we keep all the springs of knowledge open. Otherwise, we will end up in an intellectual desert. But again, we have so much access to information. It's hard not to just read what fits our preconceived notions. So hopefully we'll be open to many books, commit to a wide variety of reading. That's being true to our humanist and our freethought tradition. For all those who made the Renaissance and the Enlightenment possible, challenge yourself, read widely, support your local library. Don't let the book burners win. Thank you very much. And instead of ring it, I got read it and read out instead of ring out. I practice this 5 times, and every time I blow it on one of those. So good luck. If I had a hammer, I'd hammer in the morning, I'd hammer in the evening, all over this land. I'd hammer out danger, I'd hammer out a warning, I'd hammer out the love between my brothers and my sisters, all over this land. Ready? If I had a book, I'd read it in the morning, I'd read it in the evening, all over this land. I'd read out danger, I'd read out warning, I'd read out the love between my brothers and my sisters, all over this land. Not bad. I didn't hear any mistakes. If I had a song, I'd sing it in the morning, I'd sing it in the evening, all over this land. I'd sing out danger, I'd sing out warning, I'd sing out the love between my brothers and my sisters, all over this land. Last verse is the loudest. Well, I got a hammer, and I've got a book, and I've got a song to sing all over this land. It's the hammer of justice, it's the book of freedom, it's a song about love between my brothers and my sisters, all